Okay, sorry about the brief delay in getting going here. I hope everyone's can hear me. I wanted to make sure that I got everyone emailed out the PowerPoint slides for this week for what we're doing. They should track along pretty closely what I'm doing today and also into Wednesday. So look for those. I had a little bit of trouble pulling up email here at CNN, but it should be on its way to you. You should be able to open those up and sort of follow those along. Again, my initial plan had been to send those or to post those in the learning module for the week. Unfortunately, that isn't working for whatever reason. And the fact that I can't figure it out and distance learning can't figure it out seems to be something that is just a mystery because we've done it before. So anyway, follow along, take a look at those. I wanted to update where we are in the class at the moment. And one of the things I wanted to make a little bit of an update here is we're going to finish up because when we ended up prior to the first exam last week, we were into chapter 3, and chapter 3 is a pretty dense chapter. There's a lot going on there. There's demand, supply, there's equilibrium, there's shifts and new equilibriums and whatnot. There's out of equilibrium conditions, shortages and surpluses. And then we got into a little bit of the issue with consumer surplus and producer surplus. And that's where we sort of finished it. But what we didn't get into is price controls. And I wanted to cover that today. As I was looking over the syllabus over the weekend, sort of preparing for this week, it really occurred to me that in looking at chapter 4, I really wasn't happy with what we're seeing in chapter 4. I really can't get comfortable with that. And it's usually, it covers a lot of the finance piece, which even though that's my own expertise, it's really not necessary, I don't think, in a micro course to talk about that. So we're going to skip chapter 4, and I want everybody to be aware it's not because we're a little bit behind on the schedule. That has nothing to do with that. We could easily cover an extra chapter. It's just that I really don't think chapter 4 covers a lot of what we want to talk about. And really a lot of the material, when I talk about the labor economics, which is an important part of micro, a lot of that is best covered in chapter 14 anyway. So chapter 14 is coming up a bit later. And it's probably situated a little bit better in the chapter, to be honest with you. I don't think I was really ready to get into the labor piece just yet. Okay, so we will talk about that, or we won't talk about that. We'll talk about the labor piece when we get to chapter 14. We will get into talking about chapter 5 today. Chapter 5 is an important chapter, and we are now at the point where we have covered really all of the sort of background material that we should be covering for an introductory course, whether it's micro or macro. So chapter 5 really is a true micro chapter, and everything else going forward is as well. So we'll cover that today and Wednesday. When we come back next week, we'll also be talking about chapter 6. Chapter 6 is also an important chapter, which sort of begins to also get us into the nature of consumer economics, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Some of this will be alluded to today when we talk about chapter 3. The reason that some of this material from chapter, and I'm going to go back just a little bit to talk about consumer and producer surplus, but the reason that material in chapter 3 is so important to what we're doing going forward is that material is going to come up again and again, particularly this issue of consumer surplus, producer surplus, in how economists measure this general idea of efficiency in markets. That is, how do we know if a market is efficient or not? And by the way, what does that even mean, efficient? Well, we'll give a pretty good definition of what market efficiency is. We've already talked about a couple of efficiencies from a sort of a broad, general economic point of view. When we talked about productive efficiency, that is producers, whether they be individual firms, even individual workers for that matter, but individual firms, individual industries, individual countries are utilizing their inputs to the most and the fullest potential. And allocative efficiency was the other one, which talked about the idea of, is a society producing the goods which society most wants and needs? There are society, well, just to give you an example of an economy that's out of control, and has been for a long time, North Korea, a command economy, which has massively overspent on military spending, particularly since really no one's threatening it, not that I know of at least, and has underinvested in food. And you might say, well, they can't grow enough food to feed their population. Well, they're not alone. A lot of countries can't, but they would invest in importing that and then trading with others the things which they do best. But they don't really trade with others so much. And so as a result, that's an economy that's really out of control from an efficiency standpoint, an allocated efficiency standpoint. So we talked about productive and allocative efficiency. What we're going to get into now is more just a more micro view. It's the name microeconomics, and we're going to talk about which buyers are advantaged and which sellers are advantaged or disadvantaged by market outcomes. And we'll get to that beginning of chapter 6 and in subsequent chapters. Chapter 5 is going to deal with something called elasticity. And it's really a critical topic. It doesn't come up very much in macro. If you've had macro before, you might not have come across it at all. We're going to introduce that. And I'd like to take my time on chapter 5 because it's so important to a lot of our understanding, and even things that I think you may have come across just as an ordinary consumer, just as an ordinary buyer of goods. Why is the price of this the way it is? This can answer some of those questions. And then next week, we went into chapter 6. Also, a brief word on the exam. I know that I heard from a couple of people who had a little bit of technical difficulty on the exam, and I've got a reply to a couple. Unfortunately, I have a very busy morning, so I haven't had a chance to reply to anything that you might have posted late last night or this morning, but I will get back in touch with you. Hopefully everyone had no difficulties in getting through the exam. It was 40 questions, all multiple choice, and your results should be visible. If they're not visible to you, let me know. Sometimes we have this issue where the grades aren't visible right away. There's a switch that needs to be flipped, and I know that we've been working with Brightspace 4 or 5 semesters, but it seems like there's some new challenge all the time that we're uncovering. So, but hopefully you'll be able to see how you did. Remember on the exams that the lowest of the 4 intermediate exam scores are dropped. So if you didn't do as well as you thought you might have on this one, well, then maybe stay tuned and see how you do on the next one, and see how that goes. And so again, it's not an average, we just dropped that. Okay. All right. So questions about that. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I don't see anybody raising their hand or whatever as far as that goes. So let me go ahead and pick it up. If you do have questions, feel free to jump in, because again, as I always say, I can hear you, and I'm really glad to make this as interactive as possible for those of you who are on the live Zoom link. By the way, I'm going to take some of those announcements down with the Zoom links. I think we can pretty much count on this link being there. I've got a class in which what we thought was permanent. The Zoom link did not stay permanent, but I think we can probably maintain that. But I will probably just continue to post the announcement, just so that particularly if you're on a device that that you don't have that saved on you, you can log in from anywhere. Okay. All right. So let's talk about just a fragment of information from chapter 3 that we want to go over. And I want to talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus just real briefly. We covered this last time, and I just want to make sure just that we're sort of reviewing where we were on this. And sometimes it's necessary or helpful to go back in order to go forward sometimes. And so I just want to reiterate briefly what those are. And if you are looking at the PowerPoint package, I gave a definition of consumer surplus that is defined as the value accruing to buyers of goods who are willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price. How did we define this when we first talked about consumer surplus? We said that if we just take some ordinary generic looking demand curve here, and we'll get one started over here as well, and we have some supply curve, upward sloping, looking something like that. And we have some market price, whatever the market price happens to be. And I think the example that I might have used in class was Diet Cokes. I think that's what I had said. And I said that the market price is, say, $3.99 for those, or maybe it's $4. I don't remember. But if you had gone into the store and you planned to pay $5 for 12-pack of Diet Coke, and I don't know, that may be high or low. I don't know what the price actually is. But let's say you expected to pay $6, right? And if you expected to pay $6, but the price is actually $3.99 or $4, then you will take the $3.99. But if you're willing to pay $6, you're definitely willing to pay $5, right? So anybody who is willing to pay $6 is willing to pay $5. And you may even, this may all go all the way up to, say, $9. Somebody's willing to pay that much, to the point where this actually intercepts there, okay? And in fact, we could just simply draw it to make it intercept there if you like. But this entire shaded region here is simply what we would refer to as consumer surplus. And when we talk about consumer surplus, what are we saying? We're simply saying that it's the value that buyers would get who are willing and able to pay a price that's greater than the market price. Because why? Because the market price is market determined. And because it's market determined, we don't have to haggle over the price. We don't have to negotiate. We just take the price as given and we count ourselves lucky and we move on and take that lower price. Now, if we expected to pay $2, we're in for a tough bargain, because then somebody who wants to pay $2 and it goes for $4 is going to have difficulty. And as I think I may have alluded to this a bit last time, that we don't really have a society in which people can argue over the price of goods, with the exception of big ticket items, and of course houses and cars come to mind, where there is substantial amount of bargaining from time to time on those goods. But if it's something low budget, you're probably not going to be able to do it. In fact, I would imagine that the more you create a fuss at a store arguing you should only have to pay $2, and I'll give you $2. No, it's $4, I'll give you $2. I would imagine they'll probably call the police on you at some point, really, because you're being a nuisance. That's just the way our society is sort of wired. It's a take it or leave it proposition for those kinds of goods. Although in other cultures, it is very expected to haggle over them. Obviously, in a high volume, churn and burn kind of stack it high and let it fly sort of inventory situation, there's no ability to sort of negotiate on price. And so as a result, anybody who does want to haggle is probably in for a rude awakening. And in fact, there is no point of intersection here. $2 does not clear the market. Okay. So that's, again, this whole shaded region is consumer surplus. And what's the thing to know about this? And that is this: if the price of a good goes up, consumer surplus will tend to fall. And likewise, if the price of the good falls, consumer surplus will go up. So this looks a lot like the demand function, or the law of demand, doesn't it? The price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down, the quantity price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. Well, it's a very similar case that the consumer surplus can be made manifest by quantity demanded. And so as a result, what do we see here? We're saying that something which is not exactly earth-shattering, but if a consumer wants lower prices, they want lower prices because it advantages them, obviously. And if prices go up, consumers are less advantaged. And so when we talk about this shaded region here, I know it sounds just overly theoretical and very academic and very sterile, and sort of a divorce from the actual world. But I'm going to make the case to you that it's really not, because in the real world, there are examples of the computation of what consumer surplus is based upon what we know what the demand function is, through a process known as demand estimation, which is a statistical process, mathematical and statistical process. And we know that the price is pretty much given, and we know, what the outcome is going to be for a particular price, both from a consumer standpoint and a producer standpoint. I'll come back to the producer standpoint in a minute. Why does this matter? It's going to matter particularly when we get deeper into talking about things like monopolies. Monopolies are firms that it's one firm supplying the market, and there are instances of monopolies. A true monopoly is where it's just one firm selling an entire good on a worldwide basis that are pretty rare. But we see lots of local monopolies, in particular things like utilities, water utilities, electric utilities, gas utilities. Those tend to operate as monopolies. So P&M is our only electric provider in Albuquerque, for instance. And so what would stop P&M from doubling your electric bill? Well, regulation. And that regulation is informed in part by studies of impacts on consumers from changes in the price, which they call rates. It's the only industry which they call their prices rates, I guess because it's based upon a kilowatt usage rate, but it is a price. And so as a result, and very often we hear on the news, hey, P&M has gone to the Public Regulation Commission in Santa Fe to request a rate increase, i.e. a price increase. And therefore, there's debate about what the effect will be on consumers. We know that a price increase will reduce consumer surplus. The question is it a fair trade-off? And does P&M actually need it because of their own higher costs and whatnot? And there's an entire subfield of micro that deals with that kind of regulation, okay? Utility regulation. All right, so that's real briefly producer surplus, or I'm sorry, consumer surplus. If we go back to the same case, let's just take the same good. I think I may have used different goods last time, but if you've got a good that sells for $3.99, that's the market price, the market determined price, and a producer is actually willing to be able to sell it for $2. And if they're willing to sell it for $2, they're willing to sell it for $3, but the price is $3.99. And so for those producers who are willing and able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price, they would earn a producer surplus. So that's the definition of producer surplus. Producers who are willing and able to sell at a price less they have the equilibrium price, are able to enjoy that rate. And again here, sorry, I think I got muted a second. And so again, why would we study that particular this particular concept? Because let's go back to the study of monopoly here a minute. When we talk about monopolies, and even industries that are not monopolies, so not even cases of electric utilities or water and gas utilities, but even firms that are very highly concentrated in terms of very few producers. There's always a study of an impact on the consumer from companies buying each other. And companies have long been engaged in the practice of buying each other, taking away. In other words, there are a lot of advantages to it. Number one, you take away a competitor because you make your competitor on your team, which means you get that competitor's customers, that customer's products and territories and patents and all that good stuff. But by so doing, how does that impact the consumer? And we'll talk about this. It's an area of the law known as antitrust. And we'll talk about what the origins of the term trust are and what all that is. And I'll try to keep it more to the economics, the legal aspects of it, because there's an entire section of the law, an entire division of the Justice Department that deals with nothing but that. But from an economic standpoint, why is the law responsive to the economics of it? It's because a monopoly can thereby expand its producer surplus at the expense of consumer surplus. And that would be considered a definition of market inefficiency when you've got a wild imbalance between the two. So when we talk about efficiency, that's one particular definition of that. So what can we say about producer surplus? If the price of a good goes up, producer surplus is also expected to rise. This is not a huge surprise, I think. And then if the price goes down, producer surplus is also expected to go down, which also sort of mirrors the the methodology that we use in order to describe the law of supply. So this is really a supply side concept, isn't it? This is really a demand side concept. So consumer surplus, producer surplus. And I know last time I talked, we got to do a little bit of the math on this, where I said that if this forms a right triangle and something like this, that I didn't really draw it because I wasn't really planning to set it up this way. But if you got, and I'll just use these markers here. So if you've got a right triangle there, which constitutes producer surplus, and a right triangle there, which constitutes consumer surplus, and you can figure the area as 1/2 base times height, this being the base, this being the height. They would share a common height in this case, and maybe a different base type of thing. And we'll get into some examples of this a bit later. We're not going to do too much of this yet. The 1/2 of it is just simply the fact that this is 1/2 these are simply 1/2 of a square, basically, length times width. And so you're going to have the base, which is a dollar figure, and the height, which is a number or a quantity. And one of the things that I had mentioned to you before was that you're going to end up, whenever in economics you have a dollar figure, multiply it or divide it by a number, you're always going to end up with a dollar figure. Some dollar figure is going to be the answer. So when we talk about consumer and producer surplus, we're actually talking about actual dollars in terms of value. Tens of millions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars. Sometimes these are large. These can be very large values, which is why there's a lot of regulation brought to bear on markets in which there's a wild inefficiency and inequity between consumer and producer surplus. We have a long-standing tradition in this country. The tradition has really sort of informed the law, and that is we value competition over cooperation. And by that, I mean on the supply side. That is, we have a long-standing idea that firms who supply products should compete against other firms because that gives us the best prices, the best quality, the best service, the best reliability, their desire to stay in business for a long period of time, yada, 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 all those things which are considered to be good things. And they made themselves into the law so that if one firm tries to get a stranglehold over a market, that it's considered to be inefficient, and because it tends to reduce consumer surplus. Now, what's very interesting is I'm reading a biography of John D. Rockefeller at the moment. We're going to talk more about this. Is just coincidental that I'm reading this. I got it as a Christmas gift. But Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil monopoly, one of the very first monopolies. And it's interesting in reading about his perception of this was that he thought, okay, what if we have monopolies, but we don't take away consumer surplus? And I don't know if he even used the term consumer surplus. And that it was a very clever way of sort of concealing his monopoly for a very long time. This was long before cable TV or whatever. Nobody really even knew that the monopoly existed because they operated under different trade names, different managers and whatnot. So it's a fascinating bit of history for those who like that sort of thing. Not everybody likes that sort of thing. I do. Okay. All right. So that does it. Again, we've talked about this before, but I wanted to sort of get into a bit about these dynamics. These can shift. So if the price goes up, consumer surplus is going to go down. If the price goes down, producer surplus is going to go down. So I think we need to understand that these things can change. And it's just like our description of demand and supply generally is that what did I say about a demand function or a demand curve or a supply curve? That these are graphs of functions being equations, and therefore the math can change. And when the math changes, the market changes. And one of the things that I think is pretty obvious to everybody is the fact that things are always changing in economics. Market prices are changing, suppliers are changing, quantities are changing, all these things are in flux. And so because these things are in flux, things are always moving around, and it's important for us to realize that it's really hard to look at something in a market context and say we can nail this down. Just glue this onto the market graph because it's not going to change. It really doesn't work that way. And in fact, even when we get into some things where the government tries to make it so, to put its own particular stamp on things, it doesn't always work that well either. And so this leads us then naturally to a good segue to price controls. And so let's talk about what price controls are. Price controls really take the two forms, price ceilings and price floors. We're going to talk about both of those, but let's talk about, and I'll refer to the PowerPoint package, and those of you who are watching us live, obviously have your computers up and hopefully have been able to retrieve that from your email. I just sent it to whatever email is registered in Brightspace. I think it probably is your CNM email address. I know a lot of people don't use their CNM email address. You do have one, so if you didn't know you had one, that's where it has gone to. So, so what about price controls and what are they? Okay, well, what they essentially are is this. What's the definition, sort of a textbook definition? They're normative judgments by government as to the correct price of a good. So let's sort of tear into this a little bit, unpack what this is saying. So remember, we talked about normative economic statements, and we said, what are normative economic statements? We said that they're statements of what should be, as opposed to positive economic statements, which are statements of what is. If I said that, Ford produced 10% of Ford's vehicles are electric vehicles at the moment, and I don't know if that's the correct percentage, but that would be an objective, measurable, positive economic statement. It's not positive in the sense of good news again, but positive in the sense of it's able to be assessed and judged. If I said that Ford should produce half of its vehicles as electric vehicles, then that would be a normative judgment. That's something that I feel, just me personally, that they should be hitting it. And and I know that Ford itself has said that they want to make all electric vehicles at some point in the future, which is a pretty astounding thing to hear, because a few years ago they weren't saying something like that. But so you get the idea. Again, things are changing. But when we talk about normative judgments, we're talking about what should be. And one of the things about normative judgments is that it's in the eye of the beholder, and because it's subjective, it depends on who's doing the judging. In this case, we're going to say that the normative judgments with regard to price controls are those made by government because the price of the good that's being produced in the market is not correct, that it doesn't yield good results for society. And so as a result, there's got to be something different going on. Okay. So the first of these that I want to talk about is a price ceiling. And this is the one that's maybe the most commonly seen out there, probably the most familiar to most of us, because it really deals with the consumer side of the economy. If you just take a regular PQ market, okay? And let's just take gasoline because it's one that always is on our minds and whatnot. So let's say we've got a demand curve for gasoline. And by the way, when we get into talking about elasticity, we're going to sort of depart from this view of demand curve being sort of this 45-degree downward sloping curve. We're going to see other configurations of demand, So that's, if you've been reading ahead, you might see that that's coming for right now. Let's not worry so much about that. Let's just draw this sort of X configuration. And let's take the market for gasoline, okay? And let's take not oil, which is the crude product, the raw material that trades at a wholesale level, but rather the price at the gas pump. And let's say that consumers are, in a particular locality, are paying $5 per gallon, okay? Obviously, that's not what we're paying here in New Mexico at the moment, but there are places in the country that are pretty darn close to that. And a lot of it has to do with taxes, and I'll talk about the tax issue here a bit later, okay? All right, so what about this idea of $5 per gallon? Okay, to the demand side, particularly those who've been around a lot longer than others, $5 is considered a ridiculously high price. Even though, by the way, it's market determined and the market clears at that price, but there's no shortage, no surplus. You have some equilibrium quantity that's being produced at a price of $5 per gallon at the retail level. Nonetheless, a lot of times people say this is highway robbery, we've got to do something about it. So as a result, government would sometimes be motivated to step in and say, let's limit it. And let's make a price that we'll call P bar, and we'll say the price should only be $4. $4 is enough, is the judgment by government as to the correct price of the good. In other words, setting a bar to the price, and so as a result, setting up an artificial price that we would simply refer to as a price ceiling. As a price ceiling. And here, what I want to refer to is the idea, when we talk about ceilings, we think of ceilings as being up there. Think about a ceiling as being down here, because it's saying, what the price ceiling is saying is, it can be any price below the ceiling, it just can't go above the ceiling, including to the price which clears the market. So the price ceiling is a price below the equilibrium price, below the market determined price. Why? And it's done because of the fact that it's felt by policymakers and by the public that the price is too high. So something has got to be done. Now, let me say something about why price controls in general are implemented and why they happen, even though it's long been against the advice of economists. It's done for good intentions, and that's the idea that policymakers will jump in and say, look, the market is being disadvantaged, and so as a result, we're going to step in and we're going to limit the price because of the fact that it's inefficient for consumers, and people are already struggling. And we'll always hear this from politicians. People are always struggling, and how can we expect them to pay $5 per gallon? Okay, well, that's always a fair argument. There always are going to be people struggling, no matter what economic times we're talking about. There are always going to be people struggling, and there will always be politicians talking about people struggling, and therefore trying to put controls in the markets. Here's the problem: nobody's outlawed the law of demand. Nobody's outlawed the law of supply. Those do not follow legal laws, but instead they are what they are. Here's the problem with the price ceiling, and that is this. This now gives us a new quantity demand, which is down here, and a new quantity supply, which is down here. And it's this guy that I think is the most important to talk about. But you've got an issue where quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. And this is simply the case where, just like I think we might have had this in the opposite order, quantity demand on the left side and being greater than quantity supplied. It doesn't make any difference. It's the same inequality, essentially, but it results in a shortage, right? It results in a shortage. Because, and it's not so much that at $4, people who were economizing, driving less, maybe making one stop per day rather than going across town to Costco to buy something, maybe they'll shop a little bit closer, do a little bit less driving. Maybe now they'll drive a little bit more, and so as a result, there'll be more quantity demanded of the good, but also there'll be less quantity supply because sellers who said, you know what, at $5 a gallon, I was doing okay. At $4 a gallon, I'm not doing okay. And so as a result, as a seller, I'm going to close my doors at 9 p.m. instead of being open 24 hours. So as a result, I can't do it. I can't pay the labor around the clock in order to do that at $4 per gallon. At $4 a gallon, I'm barely breaking even. And what we haven't talked about, which is going to be very relevant to the supply curve, but we'll get to it, is the cost of production. We don't even know what the cost of production is here. All we know is that the producer surplus is going to go down with the imposition of the price ceiling. And again, and I think your text may have used the term effective price ceiling. An effective price ceiling is one that limits the price and does what it's intended to do, that is bring the price to the demand side down. If the government were saying, don't charge a price for gasoline of $10 per gallon, the supply side would simply say, okay, we weren't going to, but okay, right? We weren't going to charge $10, but we'll keep that in mind. We won't do it, and we'll only charge the $5, right? Well, it's got to be effective if it's less than the equilibrium price, the market price of $5. So, but as a result, you have this shortage going on, and so as a result, there's less gasoline available. And the quantity is simply the difference in this interval here between here and here, whatever those dollar figures are. And this is a quantity, whatever the quantity figures are, which then you can multiply by the price to get an actual dollar figure of the shortage. But whatever the quantity difference here is represents the shortage in the market for whatever the case might be. Okay, and so this is the argument, the economic argument against a price ceiling is that, yes, it sounds like a good idea. It's done for best intentions, right? You know, but like a lot of best intentions, they don't always work out to be the case in which they don't always achieve the desired outcomes. And in this case, I think we can almost always see the desired outcome doesn't make sense. Which is not to say that there shouldn't at some point be maybe an emergency for a very, very temporary condition in which prices are limited. And I was thinking earlier about, as I was preparing this, that right after the September 11th terrorist attacks, I know it's been a while, but that day I can recall that a lot of gasoline retailers were raising the price of gasoline to astronomically high levels, because I think a lot of people thought the terrorist attacks somehow vaguely originated in the Middle East, and the Middle East is associated with oil, and therefore gasoline is now going to be somehow scarce, which was completely unfounded, and the raising of the price of the good was completely unjustified. First of all, the financial markets, which price the wholesale and hence the retail price, were all closed at that time of day anyway, and so it wasn't even trading, and then they closed for the rest of the week because of all the chaos in Manhattan where that trading takes place. So, you know, the idea of charging $7 per gallon didn't even make any sense from a cost of production standpoint. And by the way, the group that did it had nothing to do with the oil production at all. Al-Qaeda has never had anything to do with oil production. So what governors did was, I remember I was living in Indianapolis at the time, the governor of Indiana said, any firm that is caught doing this is going to be prosecuted. And because of the fact that it doesn't make any sense, it's just simple gouging and has nothing to do with cost of production. Now, I don't know what law he would have invoked to have done that. As it turns out, the next day, people came back to their senses and adjusted the price downward. But so I'm not saying there might not be some sort of temporary measure to alleviate that. But nonetheless, whether it's temporary, whether it's permanent, there's no question it creates an artificial shortage. And when I say artificial, it's not a kind of shortage that results because of a reduction in quantity because of, say, crop failures or diseases among the livestock or bad weather or anything which would be a supply impediment. I point a lot of times to the supply side as being sort of the driver of this, because remember, the demand side, okay, you might be willing and able to buy more, but if firms are less willing and able to supply quantity, then it doesn't make any difference anyway. And you're still going to have the shortage. You know, a lot of times these shortages are supply side initiated. So I think we have to look to the supply side a lot of times as to what as to how we even know that we have a shortage going on. One of the classic examples of a price ceiling, and it's so classic that it sort of makes every textbook. And I'm trying to see here. Oh, I think I talked about rent ceilings, and let me come back to that in a minute. But one of the examples that is sort of almost the classic example of a price ceiling is rent ceilings on rent-controlled housing, and it sort of highlights the sort of the perverse consequences that come about when that particular kind of price ceiling is initiated. Even though it's done, once again, for good intentions, you know, yada, yada, it's always good intentions, but nonetheless, it does result in issues, okay? All right, that's one type. So this would be a price ceiling. Let me go ahead and label this so that you have this in your notes. This is the price ceiling. And it's an effective price ceiling because it's below the equilibrium price. Oops, whoa. I just kind of lost control of the marker there. So it's a price ceiling. And again, just think counterintuitively when it comes to these, how we know these, don't think of a ceiling being up there, think of a ceiling being down here, below the market price, okay? All right, so that's one form of price control. The other form of price control, which again, results from a normative judgment on the part of policymakers, usually elected officials, sometimes appointed officials, such as regulators, who would say the market price of the good is too low for whatever for whatever particular reason. Okay, so let's pick as an example here, one that would probably be a little bit more realistic, and that would be, let's say agricultural output. Say there's a particular grain goes for $30 per bushel. And that is, in fact, a market-determined price, and it results in a market-determined quantity. So the market is at equilibrium. But the problem is that, and again, a missing piece of this, so it's a piece we'll fill in a bit later when we get to it, which is coming up soon, and that is the cost of production. Because suppliers would say at $30 we can't make any money, and we're just not going to produce at $30 per bushel. There's a lot of politics behind agricultural output anyway, and I'll get to that here in just a second. But you get the idea that sometimes there's the desire to prop up particular suppliers. If there's a squeaky wheel on this side of the equation, it's the supply side. If there's a squeaky wheel here, it might be the demand side. And by squeaky wheel, I'm simply talking about the voices which are clamoring for government to do something. $5 per gallon of gas, you've got to be crazy. Government, governor of New Mexico, mayor of Albuquerque, somebody, president of the United States, do something about this. Do something about this. Right now, we've got this big debate in Washington over prescription drug prices, and with an effort to sort of limit prescription drug prices. And I don't know that it's really going anywhere, but that's a current example at the federal level. I'd be a little bit surprised if it does get done, because, and I know that there's a lot of controversy behind prescription drug prices. I've got my own particular thoughts, which you may or may not want to hear, but that's an example of where the demand side is being very vocal. Particularly a lot of retirees who retire from groups like AARP are saying, look, people can't afford prescription drugs. And if anybody who takes prescription drugs knows that some of them are really costly, just really, really costly. Even for drugs that have been around for a very long time, are no longer under patent, are very easy to produce, very simple chemicals. Some of the prices don't have any kind of bearing to cost. But as we will see later, it doesn't make any difference sometimes, because if you're able to get that price, whatever that price is, if you're able to get it, you might as well go get it until somebody tells you you can't get it. And that's where the demand side comes in. And it's understandable why these demand side objections come to light and why policymakers are sometimes forced to respond, whether it's the price of gas, prescription drugs, hospital prices, car insurance, whatever. I mean, any kind of feeling on the part of the demand side that the price of this is too high, the government's got to do something, will oftentimes see this this imperative to try to get in and create a price ceiling. Okay. All right. So there's one example of so that's the squeaky wheel. Here's the demand side. Here's the opposite side of the market. It's the supply side, where suppliers are saying, you know what, at $30 per bushel, we can't make enough money, and so therefore we're just not going to plant. Well, okay. I mentioned there's a lot of politics involved in agriculture generally, particularly regarding from the supply side of the market. I do come from a farm family, and so I'm very familiar with these issues where the market price is the market price. And one of the things about agricultural output, as we see, is the prices are very flexible. And by flexible, that might sound like a good thing, but it might not. It might be a good thing if you're a seller and those flexible prices are to the upside. But if you're a seller and the flexible prices are to the downside, not so much. Here, I don't even know what the particular grain is. Maybe it's oats or wheat or barley, I don't know. But $30 is considered to be not sufficient to make money. And so suppliers will say, we're just simply not going to plant as a result. Now, why is it political? Well, there's a lot of politics involved in this. Number one, farm states, that is states in which a lot of the economic output is driven by agricultural output, have a tremendous amount of output, a tremendous amount of political influence in Washington. A state that's very sparsely populated like Wyoming, which only has one House member, nonetheless has 2 Senate members. And so they have the same number of Senate members as a manufacturing state like New York or New Jersey or California. So as a result, and you multiply Wyoming by, add Wyoming to other very sparsely populated states that do almost nothing but produce agricultural output. South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Nebraska. I mean, yes, there are manufacturing, there's service, and there's, retail and all that, but it's the big driver of the economy's agriculture that gives them lots and lots of political influence. And this is something that I learned from my grandfather, who was a farmer and a rancher, is that the more vocal that they're able to get, the more responsiveness they're able to get from their from the federal government. And they are a very squeaky wheel. My grandfather had a very squeaky wheel. It was a very loud proponent of higher grain prices, which doesn't sound good to the consumer, and it's not. But then again, we have never tried to sugarcoat the fact that economics is controversial. One side oftentimes gains at the expense of another side. It's just simply the way that tends to work. So in the case of $30 per bushel, it's not enough. We need a higher price. And so as a result, government is being asked to step in and create a new price, which we're going to call P-bar, which is now a price floor. And we're going to say the price is now $45. Okay, $45 is the price that we have to have in this market. So this particular price structure is known as price floor. And just like the case of a price ceiling, don't think of a ceiling as being up there, but down here. Don't think of the floor as being down there. Think of the floor as being up here, because suppliers are allowed to sell at any price below this price. They just or any price above that price. They just can't fall below that price, because that's the price that's mandated in the market. That's the price. This is sometimes called a price support. And by the way, producers who try to sell at 50 and 55 won't find a market anyway. It just won't clear the market. So this is sometimes called a price support. The problem with the price supports is that now you've got quantity supply, which is out here, and quantity demand, which has fallen back to here. So now what we have is we have a surplus. And again, just as in the case of before, where we had, it's the same case that we talked about, quantity demand being less than quantity supply. That quantity difference, that is the distance between the two values on this interval, which is a quantity index, would represent the amount of overproduction that results in the market. Not to mention all the effects on consumer surplus, right? Consumer surplus is going down. Consumer surplus was this entire shaded region here. Now it's just this shaded region. And the price goes up, it's going to be even less of a shaded region, which is, again, measurable from a mathematical standpoint. So beyond the fact that there's a reduction in consumer surplus while producer surplus rises, you've also got this case of a surplus. There's excess production going on. And we know this, we know that there have been lots of instances of these particular kinds of cases in which there are surpluses. I know that my father-in-law grew up in Michigan, and they have lots of price supports there for the dairy products. And there would be cases in which there would be overproduction of milk, simple milk, and they would end up just simply pouring it down the drain. Huge vats of milk. And you might say, well, why aren't those given to the poor? And in some cases, they are given to the poor. And in fact, I know we've all probably heard this term welfare cheese before, right? Which is a dairy product that really comes from the excess production of surplus milk, right? It's a refined milk product. And which I know that we had somebody in our neighborhood when I was a kid who would just simply go down to wherever the office was and go get these big blocks of cheese. It was called welfare cheese. I don't know if it's really true of welfare. I don't even think it was needs-based. I just think you went there and showed up and they gave you cheese. And it was excess production. So obviously something that's for free is not an equilibrium price. It's not an equilibrium quantity either. It's an out of equilibrium condition. But at least the government was trying to do the right thing, I guess, by providing that surplus quantity. But in some cases, some of this output was destroyed. And just absolutely, which is inefficient. And you might say, well, why isn't that then given to other countries? And the argument against that, which is a very, sort of insensitive argument, is that it would end up doing the opposite of what the intent would be to do. By dumping that supply on the worldwide market, it would bring the price down. And that's counter to what the original goal was, which was to bring the price up. So, and again, a lot of these commodities are traded on a global market anyway. The US is a little bit different because we're such a large economy. And the US has prided itself since its the very beginning days of being self-sufficient in food. It doesn't mean we produce everything. We probably don't produce enough wine to meet our consumption, so we import some of it. I don't know that wine is that critical of a good, but things like bananas and pineapples and whatnot. Well, I guess pineapples we make in Hawaii, but bananas we don't really make in the US. That's imported. Sugar is imported for the most part. But we could survive on just what's being produced. But the point about commodities, the term commodities simply refers to a market for what is known as an undifferentiated product. That is, corn is corn, milk is milk, wheat is wheat. It's all the same thing. You can't really differentiate it. despite sellers' efforts at the retail level to do so, and we'll talk about that. So again, the shortage arises because at this price, sellers, hey, I like that price, I'm going to produce more, particularly if you've got government buying up the surplus, which is what has happened. And then you've got the demand side saying, okay, less, because we don't like that higher price that translates to the demand side, okay? So both of those are out of equilibrium conditions that result from, again, good intentions, the best intentions of government saying, okay, we need to protect one side of the market. And so it's this idea of protection that I think is important to know about. It's not government's desire to create these sorts of inefficiencies, but they do it for political reasons, and sometimes they feel like they have to. Now, when we get to chapter 14, and which is a labor piece, we'll get into talking about one particular kind of market. And I do think it's best that we talk about the labor market a little bit later, because that's an input market where right now pretty much what we've been talking about are outputs. But one particular form of price floor is a wage floor. It's called the minimum wage, and there have been debates since the very beginning of the minimum wage. I mean, I know that if you hear the local news media, they'll make it sound like the minimum wage debate is something brand new. This is something that now people are now starting to talk about. It's like people have always been talking about the minimum wage, and whether or not it's too high or too low. Usually, you'll hear it as being the fact that it's too low. And I think there are a lot of labor economists who argue that the federal minimum wage is too low if you factor in the fact that where minimum wages were back in the, say, early 70s, prior to the inflation, which began in the 70s and continued through the early 80s. And through today, inflation moderated a bit, but it didn't mean it went away. And so if you were making $3 per hour in 1972, that would probably be sufficient maybe to survive, not thrive and drive a Mercedes, but sufficient. Today, $3 per hour simply would not be enough. I don't think. You'd have to live very simply or rent-free or something in order to make that happen. So there's a lot of debate about what is the right minimum wage. And there's lots and lots and lots of debate about that. Again, lots of labor economists believe the minimum wage, which has come up at most places. The federal level has lagged tremendously. What is it, $7.25 per hour? That is a very low minimum wage compared to a lot of localities, like in, I believe it was $11.50, I think, in Albuquerque. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's $11. I don't know. But there's been an effort nationwide to try to get a $15 minimum wage, and in some places that has happened. The argument against the minimum wage, for those who argue against it, is that it creates surplus labor. A lot of people want to interval, and the supply side here is the supply of labor. The demand side here is the demand for labor. Workers wanting that higher wage, suppliers or demanders, as employers wanting to hire fewer. And as a result, you get unemployment, which is the definition of unemployment is surplus labor. So as a result, the argument against minimum wage laws are the argument that it creates unemployment. And I think we can debate that. I think probably for, I'm not a labor economist, even though I've taken a lot of labor, studied a lot of labor economics. I think maybe that could be the case for low-skilled workers, particularly like teenagers and those who are dependents of others, where it's not that critical. If there's teen unemployment has always been high, because we can measure, there are all kinds of different ways by which we measure unemployment. And we get in generally to the age of 16, which tends to be around the age in which what we call non-farm workers can enter the labor force, and in most states. And so between 16 and 18, 16 and 17-year-olds, they've always had a higher unemployment rate, but they're often dependents of parents, right? Usually, right? Or some guardian. And so if they lose their job, it's usually not the world, because they don't have the same sorts of responsibilities. But nonetheless, there is a higher unemployment rate. And one of the explanations for that is the fact that they're being overcompensated for what they are delivering from a skills standpoint. And I mean no disrespect to unskilled workers, because I think all of us at one time, none of us come, to the world with skills. I was a very unskilled worker when I was a teen, and even when I was in college, I was an unskilled worker. And I didn't make very much, because I didn't have much to offer, right? And and that's, most of us start out that way. And so as a result, employers who are saying $15 minimum wage, I cannot hire a person with no skills for $15 per hour. They may have a point. And I think it depends upon the particular firm and whatnot. And they may say, rather than hiring 20 workers, which I'd rather have, I'll hire 16 workers and expect a lot more of them. That sort of thing. That is an equation that does come up. And having worked in management before, where we've been faced with trying to raise wages just to sort of keep pace with competitors, the conversation has often been, we can't afford to pay whatever it is, bank tellers or whatever, this wage. And so we're going to have fewer of them, and we're just going to have the ones that we're going to ask more of them. And maybe we'll create some sort of incentive program or give them an extra week of vacation or something that doesn't cost us very much. These are the conversations that employers will make. We'll get to that more in chapter 14. Okay? I'm going to leave these up here because I want to go through a couple of the slides, and then I'll just briefly get into the elasticity piece. Today, what we're going to do is mostly just define what elasticity is and define some of the more common measures of elasticity. But let's talk a bit about some of the problems with price controls in general, and specifically ceilings. And I bring up rent ceilings as one sort of notable case because it's really the most famous, and there's been so much work done on rent ceilings and the effect on rent ceilings. There's been so much academic research that it's almost difficult to argue with the conclusions just because they're so powerful. Even if you think rents are out of control and somebody should do something about them, they nonetheless create lots of unintended consequences that nobody who had best intentions in terms of creating outcomes would have foreseen happening, but it does happen. So what about rent controlled housing? So I don't think we have ever had an experience in New Mexico with rent controlled housing. It doesn't really appear to be this part of the country. It's mostly East Coast, and I think the Bay Area of California probably has had rent controls before. New York City is probably the singular example, but it's not just the United States. There have been rent controls that have been put in place throughout Europe, and other parts of the world, where, because simply a function of supply and demand for housing, there's just not enough housing to go around for the population that's demanding it. So there's lots and lots of demand and a little bit of supply. And so as a result, that's a recipe for high prices. And so the rents that are being charged in those areas are market controlled rents. Are market determined rents. Rents being simply the price of renting a premises, right? But then if they're getting out of reach, then there are people clamoring on the demand side to do something about it. So what about rent controls, where and a lot of times it's set to be a condition where per square foot is what you can charge. So if you're, let's say, New York City, and you're a landlord, you own a property and it's subject to rent control, which in some cases landlords have gotten creative and simply once the last tenant has finally moved on, they've simply converted to condominiums, in which case it doesn't make any difference because those tenants will now live there, own the property. But nonetheless, let's say it's the strict tenants rent landlord relationship, and what often happens is there's a shortage. In fact, there's almost always a shortage whenever there's a rent controlled situation. You can almost say there's a shortage to begin with, even before the rent control went in, just simply because of the fact that in certain, and it's usually very densely populated urban areas, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Tokyo, San Francisco, where there's just not enough land. And I mean, the effort has been going to build up. There are restrictions against doing that. You can only go up so high, and you've got more people sort of pouring in. And even if you did go up high, you'd still have to have places for people to park cars and to fill the streets with transport and all that. So you can see the issue is it's a population issue relative to what's available on the supply side. So, but nonetheless, it doesn't stop people from saying, hey, look, I can no longer afford the rent. I'm going to have to move to New Jersey now and drive 45 minutes to get to work, simply because of the fact I can't afford the rent. We have heard, even though we haven't had strict rent control, we have heard similar arguments in Santa Fe County and to some extent in Los Alamos County, where housing prices have gotten so high that even for those who own their property, the tax on those rising properties has sort of outrun their incomes in some cases. That's sort of a similar example to what's going on there, where you've got, in the case of Santa Fe County, where you've got lots of demand for housing over a lot of years, and Santa Fe has had this sort of conflict between they've really not wanted to be a big city, really they've kind of wanted to stay a little bit small, and so they haven't been growing. They've also got water issues, like you wouldn't believe, and have had for a long time, and so that sort of constrained some of the growth. But nonetheless, you have this idea where there it's a property tax issue, which is very much related to the price of the good. Okay, Let's go back to let's say New York City and whatnot. People who say, hey, I can no longer afford the rent. I can't pay $4,000 a month for rent. I've got to move to New Jersey or to Connecticut or someplace because I can't live here. Now I'm going to be forced to travel. So government, you should do something about it. So rent controls have been put in place for a very long time, but it's created lots of housing shortages to the point where, and I've got a brother and sister-in-law who live in New York and have lived there for some time, and have talked about the fact that in New York City, particularly in Manhattan, that traditionally one way that people have found apartments, as grotesque as this sounds, is to get up in the morning, get the newspaper, look through the obituaries and find out who died, and then look at the phone book and find out where they lived, and go and knock on the door and say, hey, is this apartment coming due? So, or is this apartment coming empty, right? That sounds pretty grotesque, and that's probably one of the more grotesque aspects of it, but it nonetheless is the result of that. The other thing, this is a big one, is the issue of landlords not maintaining properties is a big one when it comes to rent control. That is, if landlords are saying, look, there's a shortage, meaning that the quantity demanded far exceeds the quantity supplied, the demand side needs me a lot more than I need the supply side. So, or they need me more than I need them, in other words, I guess is how it would go. And so therefore, I'm just not going to maintain the property to the extent that I would have otherwise when I had to make this very pretty and attract people and whatnot. So maybe I don't repair the elevator for a couple of weeks and all that kind of thing. And I had a professor in graduate school who owned a property that was subject to rent control, and he said people kept breaking a big plate glass window in the very front door of the entrance. And he finally said, I'm just not going to replace it. And it's like, okay, and I mean, obviously that is a complete eyesore. I think he eventually did replace it, but people kept breaking the window. And so, he was not really particularly motivated to replace that. So you get the idea. They tend not to maintain properties to the point where properties themselves get reduced in value. And one of the things about real estate, if you know anything about real estate, is that as properties come down in value, they bring down the value of other properties around them. So as a result, you have a degradation of the property values in particular areas. And there have been a lot of famous studies from Scandinavia with regard to rent-controlled housing, where they say one way to destroy neighborhoods is to impose rent-controlled housing, rent controls, because it brings down just simply of a qualitative nature, because people aren't maintaining the properties. We know that there's something in economics called the Endowment Problem, and that is if you don't own something, you're less likely to take care of it. That's played out doubly here, because we know that if you rent a car and you run over a pothole, boom, it's like, okay, whatever. If it's your car, you'll start cussing and have, and all that come out of your mouth. But if it's somebody else's car, no big deal, right? Well, the same case of rent-controlled housing. Something goes wrong, and you're not really that worried about it, right? If it's not yours, if it's yours, you do worry about it. In the case of landlords, remember, the demand side needs them more than they need the demand side, so they're less likely to take care of it as well. So not only do you have the supply side not taking care of it, you've already had the demand side not taking as good a care of it if it's tenant controlled, or if it's a tenant situation. Okay, so low maintenance is an issue. What else can we say? The other issue is that the advantages to those is what's due to what's called economic luck. And that is, if you're lucky enough to get an apartment that's free and available, it's just simply because you got there because you were lucky. And there's a whole entire body of literature, what's called economic luck. That is, people simply giving some value or something, not because they're better, smarter, better looking, but because they're simply lucky and they lucked into the situation. And that's an example of this. If you're able to get that lower reduced rent, it's because you got lucky because there's a shortage. And so as a result, it's not because of merit or because of somebody willing to pay more. It's because of economic luck. Okay, and I think economic luck is something that most of us would argue against as being a good thing. And then we end up, this then leads us to the whole idea of the possibilities for cheating. Because this all assumes the rent-controlled housing, that everyone's going to follow the rules, including the supply side. But what if the supply side doesn't follow the rules? What if, when it comes to rent-controlled housing, let's just sort of elongate this a little bit and say, make these a little bit more realistic. Where let's say that the market price for X number of square feet is 5,000, and it goes down to 4,000, and this is per month, right? And which these are obviously very high rents for Albuquerque, but they might not be that outrageous in some parts of the world. So what happens is this: there's a possibility of cheating where somebody would say, okay, you know what? I know the rent is $4,000 a month, but I really, really, really want this apartment. It's 2 blocks from my office. My kid's preschool is 2 blocks the other way. It's a great location. I can park out in front, all yada yada, all that. I'm willing to pay you. What if a guy were to pay you $6,000 a month and $4,000 in a check and $2,000 would magically appear in cash under your door? What would that sound like, right? And you know how the conversation would go, right? Well, obviously that violates the law in addition to the whole spirit of what's trying to be accomplished here. In other words, to help people who are struggling to pay the rent, that is, with limited incomes or fixed incomes even. And then you've got somebody coming along who is willing to be able to pay a higher price. And that's not the person who was intended to be benefited. The person who's able to pay a higher price is not the issue. It's the people who are only able to pay the lower price. So, but what's to stop the tenant from cheating and taking that $2,000 in cash and just saying to everyone else, I'm sorry, it's already been rented, that sort of thing. So you get the idea that could happen. Also, there have been numerous cases of excessive deposits where, and this is probably one of the bigger complaints, which is, in fact, it's not even so much illegal, it's just sort of a gray area where, okay, the apartment's going to rent for $4,000 a month, or if these dollar figures are too ridiculous, let's just say it goes to, if it's $3,000, let's say it's $2,000, right? Okay, I'm just trying to make it a little bit more comprehensible. But it doesn't matter, it's the same direction. And okay, it's $2,000 a month, and it'll cost you 3 months of rent deposit, and you have a pet, that's another $1,000. And oh, if you want keys, that's a $500 per key that you have. That's refundable when you turn those original keys in. And if you want hot water, that's another $1,000. I mean, you get the idea. It just goes on and on and on, these sort of add-ons, which are sort of a gray area. Nobody really necessarily thought about those, but excessive add-ons and excessive deposits. And some of those are sometimes called key charges. And that is the idea that key charges are simply, I'll charge you $500 for the key, right? And then the final thing here is, and it doesn't look like I'm really going to get much to chapter 5 today, but that's okay, because I did want to talk about this. This will come up again when we talk in chapter 6, and the whole idea of where consumer and producer surplus is moving. Remember, the intent here was to expand consumer surplus, but to the extent that that only those who are lucky enough to defeat the shortage are able to get into this, is where we're sort of landing at this particular point, okay? And one final thing is the issue of subletting, and that is, say somebody is able to, because of their outstanding credit and employment profile and all that, they're able to rent the property, saying, yes, I intend to live there, because it's probably intended for principal residents only, but then they actually have no desire to live there whatsoever, and that they instead intend to simply sublet to somebody for $3,000. And we know $3,000 would be paid for because that's a market clearing price. And so as a result, you're once again pricing out those whom you were wanting to price in because of cheating, because of subletting. And subletting may or may not, depending upon the area, may or may not even be completely legal, and may or may not even be against the desires of the landlord. The landlord may or may not really even care, as long as that landlord is being is getting what he or she wants. But you get the idea that there are all these effects that probably were not in the forefront of the minds of the people who were creating these controls in the first place when it came to below market prices. The idea was to, hey, just to help people whose incomes are limited or restricted or fixed or whatever, because the prices are simply running away from their ability to pay for them. So let's put a control on it so that they're priced in. And the disadvantage will go to the supply side. And but you know, tough luck to the suppliers, because there are more voters here than there are voters here, type of thing. Okay. All right. So that's one disadvantage. Those are some. I shouldn't say one. There are numerous disadvantages to price ceilings, specifically in rent control. Just sort of cries out for special analysis. All right. Let's talk about some of the problems of price control, specifically the floors. And I mentioned agricultural output because of it just simply needs to be. It tends to be where we see it. Remember, this is protection for the supply side. So these are suppliers of goods who are sort of combining their efforts, getting together, pressuring lawmakers to and policymakers to make decisions in their favor. Again, they create surpluses. We know that. And in the cases of, well, I gave the example of something like excess milk production. the government would simply buy up the surplus, meaning that you, the taxpayer, are actually paying for the surplus that you didn't want in the first place. That is causing a reduction in your own consumer surplus in the first place. And so as a result, the taxpayer in general is disadvantaged, while the demand side generally is also disadvantaged, simply in order to meet the concerns of the supply side. And so as a result, the supply side gains while the demand side loses, at least from the standpoint of surplus, consumer and producer surplus. Also, we talked about overproduction. Surpluses are the very definition of overproduction, simply more than what's being produced. And then that goes back to this idea of allocative efficiency. Should we be producing so much of this output of a grain which we don't really need? We're overproducing, and maybe we could shift to produce something else that maybe is more needed. But maybe that particular good maybe isn't protected like some other good. Maybe that land could be used for something else other than growing crops, for instance. And that's an example of that. But it's not because of the fact there's a price support that's in there. And by the way, we could do an entire semester on agricultural economics and all the assistance that flows toward the supply side when it comes to agriculture. And despite all that, there are a lot of people on the supply side in farming and in ranching who are really struggling to get by. The economics of agriculture just really, really tough, to the point where my family no longer farms. The farmland that we do have, we simply lease to farmers who are farmers on a part-time basis, frankly. They all have jobs. They all have jobs. And when they farm, they do it on the weekends. That's what their sideline is. That's their sort of side gig. And then they lease the land from us, but it's been in our family forever. We don't own it, we own it, we don't finance it, but we also don't want to farm it because it's not what any of us want to do. My grandfather's grandchildren, of whom I'm one of them, did not want to be farmers. And I got nothing against farmers. I would have been a farmer, but the economics of it are bad, which is why we've got all these price supports and price controls and aid, special financing, special agreements, special aid to the supply side, just because it's considered to be such a vital industry. And it's one where the economics really aren't very good in the long run for a lot of producers. Okay. And then the final one here, it tends to be subject to lots of political intervention. There is no question about that. Absolutely no doubt there's a lot of politics behind the production of food. By the way, it's not just the United States that's engaged in this. One very classic example also is in the case of Japan, which has long priced price supports and subsidies for rice producers. Rice is definitely a dietary staple in Japan, has been for a very long time. It's also what we would call low value output, frankly. I mean, there's not much value to rice, and I'm not even sure there's all that much nutritional value from rice, but it's just been around for a very long time. It's a cultural thing. There's even a distilled liquor that's made from rice, and so as a result, there's lots of protection for rice. Even though Japan is even a bigger problem of land scarcity than what we in the U.S. do. In fact, it's many, many times more challenging. With a lot of people saying, "Look, why are we supporting the rice growers when we could be turning this land into whatever, you name it, schools or shopping centers or whatever?" Again, political intervention is the big thing there that sort of drives that. Okay. All right. So, are there questions for me about anything? Hopefully, everyone can still hear me. I'm always kind of paranoid that I'm going to end up muting myself, which is what I did the other day. So I didn't get into elasticity. I sort of thought I would, but I did not. But that's good, though. We'll spend the entire class session on Wednesday talking about elasticity. I'll do some examples of what elasticity is all about. It also gives you sort of a chance to maybe sort of read that chapter ahead. And by the way, in the readings, if you're reading it and you think, wow, this is really, I'm not really getting this, don't worry so much about that. And sometimes economics, unfortunately, is one of those subjects that you may have to read a couple of times to get through, and maybe you benefit from hearing some discussion of it. Okay, so, but it might be a good idea just to familiarize yourself with what elasticity is. Elasticity generally is the reactiveness, the responsiveness of one thing to another thing. We've talked about the idea the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down in the case of demand. Well, how much is what that question seeks to answer? We know that one thing goes up, the other goes down. This answers the question, how much does it go up? How much does it go down? Because the answer to that question has got lots of implications. not just the demand side, but also the supply side. And so we're going to explore that next time when we talk about elasticity. So anyway, that does it for chapter 3. And this idea of surpluses and price controls are going to come up again. I think that, let me see here, did we get into the, there's a little bit on, well, we're going to the tax incidence piece when we get to elasticity. Tax incidence is simply the taxation of goods, and how does that affect this? It's probably, and I know a lot of chapters and other textbooks will have it with this particular piece, but it's probably best the way this textbook has it ordered within chapter 5. And so we'll get to that on Wednesday. If we don't get to that on Wednesday, we'll pick that up next week. Again, I want to take my time on chapter 5 because it's such an important chapter. So are there questions for me about anything we've talked about today? Okay, I will go ahead and make this video available as soon as possible for those who are able to view it and want to view it later. Again, feel free to get with me at any time, particularly if you're having trouble viewing your score in Brightspace. Let me know and I'll try to get with you as soon as I can. So everybody have a great day. See you on Wednesday.